Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Library in Mount Vernon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this joint event between the Washington Library and the International Center for Jefferson Studies, where we're going to bring a scholar who's working on material and drawing from the archival and research resources at both institutions to discuss early America and to look at the questions that matter both to Monticello and to Mount Vernon. We've done this once before. This is the second of three shared events. Last month, we had a conversation with Laura Sandy from the University of Liverpool on her work, also drawing from archival material at both institutions. And in this opportunity to hear from a scholar drawing from both the International Center for Jefferson Studies and from the Washington Library, we're going to meet with Frank Cogliano from the University of Edinburgh, who will talk to us about the relationship between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, which apparently was a pretty complicated one. This has been an exciting series. We're going to have a third event coming soon. Stay tuned for details. Allow me now to welcome Andrew O'Shaughnessy from the International Center for Jefferson Studies, who will actually be conducting the interview. Andrew, hello.
Hello. Thank you, Kevin. My name's Andrew O'Shaughnessy. Welcome and good afternoon.
I'll step aside, Andrew, and I'll let you introduce our guest. Enjoy the interview. Take care.
It's my pleasure to be introducing Frank Cogliano, who's speaking about a book that's not yet published. It's still very much in process, which I can tell you as an author, I've always found exceptionally useful to be able to speak about a book while you're writing about it and getting a sense of what interests your audience, and some feedback while the book is actually being written. I've often joked that Frank is like an alter ego to me. I, after finishing a doctorate in England, came out to America and have followed my career in the United States. He finished his doctorate in the United States and went over to Britain and has been there ever since. And he's now professor of American history at the University of Edinburgh. He also has the wonderful title Dean International for North America. He's in charge of recruiting students from the United States for the University of Edinburgh. As Kevin mentioned, he's held fellowships at both Mount Vernon and at Monticello. He sits on the advisory board of the International Center for Jefferson Studies and is also an ex officio member of our board of trustees who comments on scholarly affairs. Frank's most recent book is called Emperor of Liberty, Thomas Jefferson's Foreign Policy. It's published in 2014 by the University of Virginia Press. He's also done a book called Thomas Jefferson's Reputation and Legacy, published in 2006, and has also edited the Blackwell Companion to Thomas Jefferson, which is an exceptionally useful volume. But this is his first foray into actually writing on George Washington and comparing and contrasting Jefferson and Washington, and also discussing their relationship. So here to join me is Frank Cogliano.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and yes, thank you to you and to Kevin and Mount Vernon and Monticello for hosting this event. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in to watch it. I would like to say a word or two about the project before we begin our Q&A. But before I do that, I want to say just a word or two by way of thanks to both Mount Vernon and Monticello for the work they do as public history institutions and as venues where important public history is carried out. Now more than ever, it's really, really important that this work goes on. But now more than ever, of course, museums around the world are really under unique pressures. So if you're able, and I know that for public health reasons, that might not always be the case, depending on where you live, or for financial reasons, but if you're able to support your local museums, please do. And I'm very, very grateful to the support Mount Vernon and Monticello have given to my research over the years, and particularly while I've been working on this project. Now, as Andrew said, I'm working on a book manuscript right now about the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. And one might rightly ask, whether we need one more book on either of these individuals, and that's a very good question. I think, and it's one scholars need to ask themselves whenever they undertake a project. I think we do need a book on them and on their relationship, in part because despite the wide coverage that the founding era of the United States receives from historians, this particular dimension to that story has received relatively little consideration by historians. We have studies of the relationship between Jefferson and Madison, for example, and Washington and Hamilton. We don't have much in the way of scholarship on Jefferson and Washington. There was one book published by Thomas Fleming, who's recently deceased, several years ago, called The Great Divide. But Fleming's book concentrated on the kind of conflict between Jefferson and Washington. And what I'm trying to do is to see their relationship over its long course. They knew each other for 30 years from, well, we know they met in 1769. My own research shows I'm pretty confident they met in 1768, but we'll say 1769, which is currently the accepted date. We know they met in 1769, and they had a relationship of some kind, and I'll talk about the nature of that relationship in the next couple of minutes, until Washington's death in 1799. And indeed, I would argue that Jefferson was concerned about his relationship with Washington until his own death 27 years later in 1826. But it's a complicated relationship, which is why I've taken that, I've appropriated that phrase, it's complicated, from Facebook to describe this relationship, because although they knew each other for 30 years and they had a relationship for 30 years, it ebbed and flowed. So they were friendly probably for the first decade, but not terribly close from roughly 1769 to 1778. Then, when Jefferson becomes governor of Virginia and Washington is commander of the Continental Army, they actually, although they don't see each other, they collaborate quite closely on matters related to the War of Independence, and we might well get into that this afternoon. And that serves as the foundation, I would argue, for a blossoming friendship, which they enjoy from roughly 1779 to 1793-94, when Jefferson finally leaves the Washington administration, having served as Secretary of State. And then in the final 5 years of Washington's life, they gradually become estranged, and undoubtedly we'll talk about that too. I think the mistake scholars often make is they read that estrangement back in time. They do become estranged late in life, although Jefferson does, or late in Washington's life. Jefferson regrets that and seeks to undo some of the damage he did to their relationship. But because of that, I think scholars have read that estrangement back over the course of time and said they didn't get along. And that's not true. I would suggest to you that they're in broad agreement during the first decade of their relationship, when they're not very close. In the 1780s, when they become quite close for a time, they enjoy a very productive and interesting relationship, and I can talk more about that in a second. And then, so much so that Washington invites Jefferson to join his cabinet and serve as Secretary of State during his presidency. And it's only late in Washington's life that they become estranged. And I want to show you an image or two to illustrate this. So Jeanette, if you could put up the slide, please, I'd be grateful. So what you see here is one of the few times that Washington and Jefferson are pictured together in a painting or an image created by a contemporary. This is a famous image from the Capitol of the United States, which will be familiar to many. It's done by John Trumbull, and it's George Washington resigning his commission, which he did in December of 1783 at the State House in Annapolis. And this is a kind of really important moment in Washington's career. It's an important moment in the history of the American Revolution. This is Washington acknowledging the importance of civilian rule in the United States. He's giving up his commission. This is a very important scene, which is why it's one of the four scenes that Trumbull was selected to put in the Capitol. But if we look more closely at it, so if you can see the next slide, please, Jeanette, we see that Jefferson is actually in this picture. And what's very interesting about this moment of Washington's resignation, Washington gave a short speech explaining why he was resigning and acknowledging the importance of civilian leadership in the United States. Jefferson was chosen to write the response to that speech, which Thomas Mifflin, the president of Congress, gave in response to Washington's remarks. But Jefferson, who's here pictured by Trumbull, you can see to the left, Jefferson actually wrote those remarks. And Jefferson and Washington met in Annapolis in December of 1783. And because in order for Jefferson to respond to Washington's remarks, he had to see them in advance. And their correspondence is very warm and friendly. It goes beyond the simply pro forma sort of your most humble and obedient servant stuff that we're familiar with in that period. And so this initiates a period, I argue, and I'm showing in the book, when they're quite close, and that they enjoy a quite close friendship and correspondence during the 1780s, both before Jefferson leaves for Paris, but also after he goes to Paris and during the time when he's in Paris. And so for the 5-year period when Jefferson's in Paris from 1784 to 89, they correspond on a number of things. And Jefferson, in part, really pays tribute to Washington. And there's further evidence, if Jeanette, you can show the next slide, please, of that closeness. So Jefferson, for example, facilitates Jean-Antoine Houdon's trip to America so that Houdon can make the famous bust of Washington that you see pictured there. And Jefferson facilitates that. And we have a quote from Jefferson from the mid-1780s that appears in the Notes on the State of Virginia, paying testimony to Washington's, paying tribute to Washington's greatness. It was also a two-way street. Washington sought Jefferson's counsel in the mid-1780s. He asked him about the Society of Cincinnati, for example, in the spring of 1784. And he, too, in his writings to Jefferson and his comments about Jefferson, is quite fulsome in his praise. So my argument is that they're not estranged. There isn't a great divide for the entirety of their relationship, but it ebbs and flows over time. And that's the story I'm trying to tell. There's lots to unpack. There's lots to explore, but I really want the way to do this, I think, most effectively is for Andrew and I to have a conversation before we take some questions from you in the audience. So I don't want to keep talking. So I'll wrap things up here and turn things over to Andrew.
Large part of their friendship, the fact that Washington defended Jefferson from accusations of his own legislature while governor of cowardice, of failing to prepare Virginia's defense before Cornwallis's entry into Virginia in 1781.
Yes, I mean that's been one of the most interesting aspects of my research thus far, Andrew, because one would think Washington, of course, is the great military hero of the American Revolution from the Patriot side, and Jefferson has no military record, and his record as the governor of Virginia is not very good, frankly, in terms of defending the state. And you're quite right that some of his political opponents at the time and indeed afterwards accused him of cowardice, and the details of that need not detain us here. What is interesting to me is I see that moment as the kind of birth of this new, closer relationship between the two. Washington never buys into that criticism, and indeed he supports Jefferson and effectively says you did the best you could with what you had. And although Jefferson is called before a committee of the House of Delegates in Virginia and to answer for his mistakes, he was exonerated, it should be said. Washington never partook of that, and indeed Washington, the great military hero of the age, stood by Jefferson in that. And I think that's a really important kind of turning point in their relationship, in large part because Washington was aware of the lengths Jefferson had gone to prepare Virginia's defenses during the war, and seemingly was satisfied by those.
In fact, you talk in your book on his reputation and legacy, how Jefferson is obsessed with this in the last few days of his life. He's still thinking about this moment in 1781 and criticisms of his handling the situation. So it's very emotionally important to him to have a man of Washington's stature and military background. Obviously made a huge difference. I think, though, the story that is not really known to a lot of people is the story that this relationship sours. In fact, after Washington's death, Jefferson visited Mount Vernon and apparently got a very icy reception from Martha. And how did that happen when clearly Jefferson always admired Washington to his dying day? In fact, he loved to tell stories of Washington to the first generation of students at the University of Virginia and to visitors to Monticello. And Washington and Franklin were the two figures of the sort of revolutionary pantheon that he most liked to talk about to visitors at Monticello. But what went wrong?
Well, that's a very good question, Andrew. And I suppose the two things you mentioned, both Jefferson's concern at his own death about his reputation from the war when he himself was dying, but also his visit to Mount Vernon after Washington's death. It goes to one of the main themes I'm developing in the book. Look, these guys do not represent all of America. The way the history of the revolution was written 100 years ago was very simple. We said, it was about great men. We don't do that anymore, but they do represent the perspective of a certain Creole elite in Virginia. And that elite is very concerned about questions of honor. And Jefferson was really anxious on his deathbed about the criticism of his governorship because he was concerned about notions of honor. Similarly, what happens with the estrangement of Washington and Jefferson, they grow apart during Washington's administration, largely because they don't agree on fundamental political questions, especially around foreign policy, but also fiscal policy. Washington agrees with Alexander Hamilton on most questions, not Jefferson, and Jefferson can't accept this. But what really leads to their estrangement is a letter that Jefferson writes in 1796, in April of 1796. He writes to an Italian man, Filippo Mazzei. Mazzei had been a neighbor of his in Charlottesville. Mazzei had gone back to Italy, and Jefferson wrote him a lengthy letter in the spring of 1796. Jefferson was retired at this point, and that's an important distinction here, more or less giving him the news. And in that letter is a paragraph which is vaguely critical of former President Washington, or soon to be former President Washington, I should say. And Mazzei shared that letter, as often happened in the 18th century, and it eventually was published in a French newspaper several months later. And then by the spring of 1797, when Jefferson is now Vice President of the United States, it appears in a rather garbled and slightly mistranslated form in American newspapers. And Washington, again, he too is concerned about his honor, really takes offense at this. And this leads to a kind of permanent estrangement between Washington and Jefferson, which never really heals. Jefferson makes a kind of half-hearted appeal to Washington afterwards, but nothing comes of that. As far as the story about Jefferson's visit to Mount Vernon is concerned, Jefferson visits Mount Vernon in January of 1801, ostensibly to pay his respects to the widowed Martha Washington. But of course, that's at the height of the election controversy of 1800, 1801, which won't be resolved until the February of 1801. And Martha Washington, who's not stupid, thinks that Jefferson, probably correctly, is there to seek Washington's posthumous imprimatur in this election controversy. And she is said to have remarked, and admittedly, the evidence for this anecdote comes from Federalist opponents of Jefferson. She is said to have remarked that the two worst days of her life were the day George Washington died and the day Thomas Jefferson came to visit. It's a wonderful anecdote. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it speaks to their estrangement.
One of the themes that you're developing is this idea of Washington having much more of a national vision, and Jefferson becoming increasingly provincial. Now, Brian Steele did a book a while ago called Jefferson as a sort of founder of nationalism, and argued that his emphasis on state rights actually was a belief that by having strong local government, it would make for a more effective nation and a stronger nation, and that Jefferson was concerned, as was de Tocqueville a few decades later, with the problem in democracies of people becoming alienated and not feeling that they can really contribute or that they have any control. And Jefferson realized it was essential, and even in late life talked about having what he called ward republics, really county government within the states that held the states accountable, that he realized that this was the only way to keep the ordinary citizen engaged.
Yeah, I would slightly push back on your characterization. The argument I'm making in the book is I think that to some extent, these are Virginians, and the story of the Revolution for both of them is about the story of their relationship with Virginia. And I think essentially the lesson that George Washington draws from the war is, despite how important Virginia is, and it's the largest of the colonies now states, it's the most populous, depending on the measure, it's the wealthiest. Despite its importance, Virginia can't go it alone. And so Washington comes out of the war a nationalist. And I'm not original in making this argument, but I think the evidence is very strong for that. Late in life, and undoubtedly we're going to get on the question of enslaved labor, late in life, Washington actually quips that maybe he'll just give it all up and go live in Pennsylvania. No, he doesn't mean that, but he's actually, Washington's vision becomes national. Jefferson isn't a provincial so much as he's a Virginian, and he believes, as you've described, and I think there's a lot of merit to what Brian Steele's argument and what Brian has to say, that America should become Virginia writ large. And so what does he do after the Declaration of Independence is adopted in 1776? He returns to Virginia to get down to what he sees as, he calls, the whole object of the present controversy, revising the laws of Virginia and reforming Virginia. So he thinks each of the states needs to do this and needs to become a self-governing republic. And he never really overcomes that or grows beyond that. So he wants the United States to be Virginia writ large, whereas I think Washington sort of sees the United States as more than the sum of its parts. And although he remains a Virginian until he dies, at some level he leaves Virginia behind. And so I think to some extent that the differences in their approach to the Revolution aren't necessarily about fiscal policy as much as they are about this broader vision of what the country should look like that even goes beyond those questions. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think you're right. I'm currently working on Jefferson's founding of the University of Virginia. And I've been surprised by how involved Washington was with education and his concern about it and the need to have an educated citizenry and elite in a republic. The citizens need to hold the elite accountable. The elite needs to govern in the interests of the people. But Washington wanted to have a national university. Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, and so that in many ways makes your...
Oh, you disappeared there for a moment, Andrew.
And I would think that a major reason that Washington had such a national vision was his experience during the war, and the same with Hamilton. And having studied the British side of the Revolution, I'm very aware of just how brittle the Patriot position was as late as 1780. And they were very dependent on French support and mostly the danger that the revolution could have gone bankrupt. And it's interesting that such a high proportion of people who participate in the process of the Constitution and writing it and the Convention at Philadelphia are military veterans.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously I'm not the first person to say this, but I think that shapes his vision on two levels. First of all, there's the fact that he recognizes and concludes, and the men around him do, that a national effort spanning all the colonies now states is necessary to succeed, but also that war effort is made up of men and women who support men from across the states as well. This isn't just a Virginia story or a Massachusetts story or a Pennsylvania story. And so that contributes to that national vision. But you're right, the leading many of the leading advocates for the Constitution were those who had that wartime experience and believed that the states sometimes were obstacles. And one could look at what happened in Virginia during the war. Jefferson himself experienced that and say, the state was not capable of defending itself, and it needed help from outside, both from the Continental Army and from France, in order ultimately to vanquish the British, and therefore a national vision is needed. Jefferson believed, I don't want to push this too far, Jefferson believed in the United States. Jefferson believed in a nation, but he did believe in a more decentralized state. and because he's concerned about the preservation of liberty and creating a centralized power and a centralized government aggrandizing power. So he believed in a crisis, and he said this in one of his inaugural addresses. The United States is the strongest country in the world because its citizens will rally to the support of the government when it needs them. But he doesn't want the kind of institutional structures that Washington feels are necessary. And you're absolutely correct. Washington drew those conclusions because of his experience during the war.
Timothy Breen recently wrote about how Washington did a national tour after the war, which I'd never fully appreciated. He documents that and the way that Washington insisted not in staying at wealthy people's homes, but staying in local taverns and not accepting any gifts and so forth. One obvious difference between them is Washington was a much more successful businessman and died very wealthy, and Jefferson died bankrupt. And it's surprising that despite Washington's status, he's often not given credit for his savvy and his street smartness in his business life as a general and in his creation of his cabinet.
Yes. I mean, I think you're right. And this kind of relates to your earlier question and your earlier comment about education. Washington had a great deal of respect for education because he's aware that he did not have much in the way of a formal education. But Washington is not a stupid man. And in many respects, he's an autodidact. He and Jefferson are very different in this way. And you talked about their contrasting fates as businessmen, and we should always remember that their primary businesses were running plantations based on enslaved labor, but also, and this is something where Washington was much more active than Jefferson, speculating, especially in Western land. And so, as a state, as managers of estates dependent on enslaved labor, Washington is much more effective than Jefferson is. Jefferson, we don't need to go into many of the details here, but Jefferson was unlucky in certain ways, and Jefferson lived long enough because he lived till 1826. He was basically ruined in the crash of 1819. So Washington, when Washington died, he was still in relatively good shape financially. So there are important kind of details that they have no control over. But yes, in answer to your question, Washington is a much more effective, shrewd, and frankly hard-headed businessman than Jefferson is. There's no doubt about that. Jefferson also spent himself into debt. Now they're both, and our mutual friend, the scholar Maurizio Valzani, has written about Washington's consumption habits. They both like to shop. There's no doubt about that. But Jefferson has trouble staying within his means. They both go into debt with their shopping. Washington gets a letter from his London merchants, his London suppliers before the Revolution, telling him how much debt he's in, and he tries to change his ways. He doesn't do it entirely because they both like to shop, but Jefferson is much more of a spendthrift, I think, than Washington was.
So as you say, Washington, a lot of his real wealth and success comes from land speculation, investments. He invests in successful stocks. But of course, they are both planters, and Washington has always, of course, received much more credit because at his death, he emancipated his enslaved laborers. Is that justified? Does he deserve a lot more credit as a planter and as an owner of human beings?
Well, those are two separate but related questions, and certainly related in important ways. So let me deal with Washington as a manager of an agricultural estate before we talk about the labor question. I think he does deserve credit for that. He early on begins to make the transition from tobacco to wheat in the 1760s, recognizing that tobacco, the future as he sees it for Virginia, is not in tobacco. That's an adjustment that Jefferson himself will make a little bit later, or try to make, although he doesn't make it as completely. Washington these are both people who engaged in the kind of intellectual world which we, as a shorthand, call the Enlightenment. Washington was very, very well read in agricultural science, as it was known in that time. He corresponded with the British agricultural writer and theorist Arthur Young at some length. Washington really made a study of this. Jefferson's interests are much wider, but because they're much wider, he dabbles in a lot of things. Yeah, Jefferson has far more expertise in far more areas, but Washington's is much deeper. It kind of epitomizes the differences between the two. As regards the question of enslaved labor, and that's obviously vital to the stories of both men, these are, as I said, Virginia planters first and foremost. It's their very ownership of other human beings in their hundreds that makes their public lives possible, and we must never forget that. You asked me, does he deserve his reputation? I often get asked, oh, who do you like, or who's better, Washington or Jefferson on this question or that? It's not, the book's not about that, but it does cry out for these kinds of comparisons. By comparison with Jefferson, Washington's effort to set some of the enslaved people who lived at Mount Vernon and other farms and outlying plantations that he owned free is much better than anything Jefferson did. It's much more effective. However, it's a complicated picture because many of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon and associated land holdings were actually so-called dower slaves who Martha Washington had inherited, or hadn't inherited, her children had inherited the claim to them from her first husband, their father. And Washington could not set those people free in his will. And so it's a very complicated legal settlement, not least because his enslaved people, those he did own, as well as those so-called dower slaves, well, as a shorthand, and this isn't entirely accurate, Martha Washington slaves, had obviously formed their own families. And so it was a very complicated situation. So he was not able to set all the enslaved people in, or to give them their freedom in his will when he died. But a significant proportion eventually attained their independence as a result of that. But Washington is a very harsh taskmaster as a enslaver. Erica Dunbar in her recent book Never Caught has shown quite persuasively just the lengths to which the Washingtons went to seek to re-enslave a woman, Oni Judge, who had escaped from them while he was president of the United States, escaped from Philadelphia, made her way to New Hampshire. Mary Thompson, Mount Vernon's own Mary Thompson, in her wonderful recent book, The Only Unavoidable Subject of Regret, has written extensively about Washington and the enslaved people and families at Mount Vernon. And Washington's a pretty strict and harsh slave driver. There's no other word for it. Now, Jefferson, as you well know, and there's been a lot of great work done at Monticello by Cinder Stanton and Annette Gordon-Reed and others. Jefferson himself, because of the debts we mentioned, Jefferson was much more eloquent in condemning slavery than Washington was. And I think, and we might get into this, the deleted clause from the Declaration of Independence concerning the slave trade is really, really important. And maybe we can park that for a second and return to it if time permits. But despite Jefferson's eloquence and his awareness of the iniquity of slavery, and he knows it's wrong, he does not take the steps that Washington takes. But both of these men are frankly deeply flawed when it comes to the question of slavery. And there's no getting around that. There's no sugarcoating that. There's no apologizing for that.
I think that's a good reply. And I partly asked it because it's generally often treated as though it is uncomplicated in Washington's case, although that is being changed by books like that of Mary Thompson. Should Jefferson get more credit for his Northwest Ordinance, which, although it was never enacted and has only got one vote in the South, but it was defeated by one vote in Congress, it would have excluded slavery in both the Northwest and the Southwest. And the final Northwest Ordinance, he wrote that in 1784, the final one did indeed use it as a blueprint and exclude slavery in the Northwest. And later, as president, he pushed Congress to abolish the slave trade at the earliest opportunity.
Yes, I think he gets partial credit, Andrew. I mean, it depends on whether we're giving credit for attempts. So yes, the attempt is there. The awareness is there that this is a problem. Again, if I can return to the Declaration of Independence, I think that's far more significant. So there's the clause, which I know you're familiar with, in the Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, where he condemns the slave trade and actually blames George III for it. As a statement of history, it's dubious, but there's some very interesting language there, because he talks about the rights of a distant people being violated. And the reason I think that's important is he's recognizing that Africans, the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, have rights. And he's using the same language of rights to apply to Africans as he's applying to people in the then American colonies, soon to be United States. And had that clause been included in the Declaration of Independence, I think the debate about who's included and all men are being created equal disappears, because that version of the Declaration of Independence, and I think this is Jefferson at his most radical, and he becomes conservative more conservative on this question as he gets older. But in that moment in June and July of 1776, I think that's a very profoundly radical condemnation of slavery that would have made the American Revolution much more revolutionary had that clause been included. Having said that, it's a bit like the failure of the Northwest Ordinance. It didn't happen. So we can read intent there, but we also have to deal in the realm of what actually happened, and it didn't happen.
And of course, there was just the realities of politics, that to get elected, you had to be able to appeal to a Southern base. And,
yes.
Not even their opponents, the Federalists, took an openly anti-slavery stance when standing for office.
And let's not just blame this on the South. Anti-slavery was not necessarily universal in the North as well. So the willingness of Americans of European descent to oppose slavery was certainly uneven, let's say, in this period. I don't like the "they were men of their time" argument, because there were men and women of that time who were opposed to slavery, not least the 1/5 of Americans who were enslaved. And so we have to, I don't buy the they were men of their time. They were men of their time, place, and class. There's no doubt about that. I think Jefferson was more radical on this question perhaps than Washington was, at least at certain times in his life. But if we judge them by what they did, Washington did more than Jefferson did by the time he died.
Well, I think we should open this up now to our audience.
Sure.
And to take a Q&A. As I said in my introduction, it's very helpful when you're writing a book to talk, just get an opportunity to articulate your ideas. It helps you frame the book when you write the manuscript, and getting these questions and answers is very helpful to you to see what people are interested in and what kinds of issues they'd like to know. So I have here a question from Valerie Gilson. How would you suggest teachers present the complicated legacies of Jefferson and Washington to their students?
This is an excellent question, and Valerie Gilson is a school teacher. I know that because she participated in a seminar I gave a couple of years ago, so it's lovely to hear from Valerie.
I couldn't quite read the last bit of it. How do you balance this issue? It's an excellent question between the slaveholder and the great man. How should modern teachers deal with this?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Valerie. I think we might want to move beyond great men. I mean, yes. I realize I use that language myself, perhaps. And it's very difficult. It depends on what age and level the students are at, but we need to move beyond great men and women and acknowledge that these are men and women in their age who are grappling with questions, and sometimes they fail, or sometimes they're struggling with complicated moral questions, and they don't always get everything right. I think if students can take anything away from this particular question, it should be that, because we ourselves are dealing with complex moral questions and political questions on an almost daily basis, and sometimes are found wanting. I think, look, there's an incredible tension which will never be resolved for historians of this period, between the revolutionary aspects of the American Revolution, the assertion of universal equality, and questions about how far that extends. And it's not only limited on the slavery question, although that's all important. It also includes indigenous people who are excluded from the political settlement, and women, and so on. There's a kind of radicalism at the American Revolution, but there's also a conservatism there. And the fact that we'll never resolve that tension. They are often found wanting by our standards. All we can do is allow students to work through the evidence and to discuss this in the ways we're trying to discuss it, and allow for nuance and complexity. But there's no getting around this.
Well, in some ways, it can be helpful to see former heroes as flawed, because that can encourage a modern generation that they don't have to be perfect still to make a positive difference. And one of the most remarkable features about Washington to me is that he was actually lost most of his battles with the British. Between Trenton and Yorktown, he was constantly defeated, and previously, and yet he managed to bounce back and come back. And in some ways, I think there's a greater story there than just in the idea of Washington as a constantly victorious general, because one of the hardest things in life is to come back from a defeat or a setback. And that's a story that in some ways can empower people much more.
Perseverance is the story with Washington and the War of Independence. Yes. You're right, Andrew, and that's an important story. That, and acknowledging throughout, even when it was difficult, the importance of civilian control of the military. I mean, those are the lessons to draw from Washington that are more universal. I think we need to move away from, and the question Valerie asked is important here. We have to move away from the founders as somehow demigods.
Yes.
And whose actions are beyond reproach, and therefore we can't question them. They were dealing with complex issues in their day, just as we are in our own day, and they get things wrong just as we do. So they have some wisdom to impart, but we shouldn't be bound, as Jefferson said, by the dead hand of the past.
Yes. So I've got a question here from Eric Johnson. And he says, Martha Jefferson expressed a really contemptuous opinion of Jefferson right at the end of her life after George Washington's death. Was this a reflection only of political disagreements between Washington and Jefferson, or was it, were there other reasons for this?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's primarily political, but what Martha and George Washington during his presidency, and they had a very close relationship. I mean, they were a married couple, obviously, but they also had a close political relationship. She was an important political ally of his and advisor of his, and they exercised politics, as we know, via the dinner table often. And so she would have seen Jefferson at close quarters during Washington's presidency when Jefferson was in the cabinet. And Lindsay Chervinsky's written about this in her own recent book on the Washington's cabinet. I suspect Martha Washington didn't like Thomas Jefferson for whatever reason. You don't like everybody you encounter in life. And I think that perhaps George liked him a bit more, at least earlier during that earlier period I talked to. So I think the differences were primarily political. But when Jefferson kind of inadvertently sabotaged their relationship, she was not prepared to make up after that. I mean, I think she could hold a grudge, and I don't think she liked him. I think there was a sort of personal antipathy, I think, that might have arisen from the fact that they just didn't gel.
And you just mentioned that Washington stood down voluntarily as commander-in-chief, and it's worth just saying that most revolutions fail. Most revolutions end in dictatorship, which Edmund Burke reminded us. And predicted the French Revolution, and yet his decision to keep the military under civilian control was really critical, even though, of course, there was huge discontent towards the war.
Yes, and sorry, if I can address that quickly, Andrew. One of the points that Jefferson makes in 1783 and 84, when he's writing about the when he responds first to Washington's resignation, but also about the Society of Cincinnati. He writes to Washington about the Society of Cincinnati and says, "Look, don't squander this wonderful thing you've done. You willingly gave up power, unlike any other revolution previously. You know, so this is an incredible achievement." So Jefferson was cognizant of that and appreciated that.
So this is quite a technical question from Cam Addis, and he's asking whether Jefferson's Northwest Ordinance, and especially his outlawing of slavery, whether that really did inspire the ultimate Northwest Ordinance of 1787. I've always thought that it was a sort of blueprint, because also Jefferson's suggestions about having a school in every town and a public system of education was present in the final form, but I couldn't say for certain. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, I'm a little reluctant. And thanks, Cam. Nice to hear from you too. To comment on Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance, because I don't have that committed to memory. But I would agree with your interpretation. And this is where we get to my argument about Jefferson wanting America to be Virginia writ large. I think when he looks at the Northwest, which had historically, as far as Virginians concerned, been their domain before they sacrificed it, as they saw it, to the commonweal. Jefferson, I think, wanted to see what in the Northwest, he wanted to see the sort of ward republics that you described as an improvement on what was going on in Virginia. So he didn't want them to have slavery and enslaved labor. And so I think that was the inspiration for him. Cam asked about whether that's the direct influence on Congress. I'm a little reluctant to answer that, just I'm not sure I have the mastery of that detail. Of course, our mutual great friend and a friend to many of the people on this broadcast, Peter Onuf, wrote the book on it literally, so Peter would know that. But it's certainly the inspiration. There's no doubt about it. And Jefferson is thinking a lot about the West in the mid-1780s, as is Washington. They're both very keen to develop the West and see the West developed as the future of the United States.
The irony is the closest approximation to the kind of local government that Jefferson envisaged was New England, with the town government system. And I think Peter actually says this, that to some extent he really wanted Virginia to be more like New England, except with totally different policies, and more Republican than Federalist.
That's right. The problem with New England is that it's Federalist dominated. As Peter likes to say, I can't take credit for this phrase. He likes to say that Jefferson had New England envy. So and interestingly, while he's serving as governor of Virginia and the British are overrunning the state, that period we referred to earlier in our conversation, he does write, he's really worried that the Virginia militia don't have the virtue of militiamen in other places, and he cites New England as an example. He says, when the British invaded New England, they turned out. What's wrong with us? So he does worry about whether Virginians, that's occasionally worry, whether Virginians have what it takes to be good Republicans, with a small r.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a question here from Rob Westman. What was Washington's response to Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson called out George III by saying the king has waged cruel war against human nature itself, slavery, i.e., mocking by calling George a Christian king?
Yes, we don't know, because Washington probably would not have seen that draft. He certainly didn't see that draft during the period when in July of 1776. Washington has sent one of the earliest drafts of the Declaration of Independence as adopted and has it read out to the troops on July 9th, I think it is, in New York. But he didn't comment on that response. And I've yet to find them having any sort of interaction. They both have a lot to say about slavery and what to do about enslaved people as they see as a problem that each of them believes needs to be solved, but they don't interact with each other on that particular question.
And I often get asked, what was George III's reaction? And we don't have any reaction from George III, although he does speak about unheard of grievances. That might be a reference to the Declaration of Independence. But of course, Pauline Maier argued that people at the time were not nearly as focused on the Declaration of Independence. It expressed what were common sentiments and grievances, and it didn't have the position among Americans that it would acquire later, even as early as the 1790s.
That's right. And Jefferson's draft of the Declaration, which Rob asked us about, Jefferson was very proud of that draft. And he always believed it was better than the one that was adopted, and he shared copies of it with his intimate friends. Washington was not one of those close friends in 1776, so he did not share a copy with him.
So this is a question from Cynthia Miller. Could you possibly talk about the letters between Washington and Jefferson and any particular conversation that might most resonate with you as signifying an important piece of their relationship?
Yeah, this is a really good question, Cynthia. Thank you. When I began this project, the first thing I did was read their correspondence from beginning to end without reference to the secondary literature. I just wanted to read what they said to each other as they said it to try and reconstruct that relationship. And what I found was, and so the correspondence more or less confirms the kind of broad outlines of the relationship I sketched at the very beginning of my remarks. That, you know, they're amicable for the first decade, but don't have much to do with each other. They interact a lot during the War of Independence, but most of that is workaday stuff about defending Virginia in response to the British. Then there's a real efflorescence. They really have a wonderful correspondence during the 1780s that begins with Washington's resignation and carries on through the years when Jefferson's in Paris down to his return to serve in Washington's cabinet. And at that point, they correspond about all manner of things. They correspond about farming. They correspond about the Constitution and theories of constitutionalism. They correspond about all manner of things. It's the most interesting period of their correspondence, and I would argue of their relationship. I was disappointed by their correspondence during Jefferson's time as Secretary of State, because they're seeing each other regularly. So in the same way that you don't correspond with people you work with every day necessarily, or you send them an email or a direct message saying, let's meet for lunch tomorrow to discuss this, their correspondence is a lot like that. So the good stuff isn't in their letters, although Jefferson is keeping his own notes at that time, which helps us recreate that. But the correspondence is less good during the later period. It's best and most enlightening about the closeness, the growing closeness of their relationship during that middle period in the 1780s.
So this is from Joretta Heckscher, the Library of Congress. It's nice to hear from you. I believe that Jefferson wrote some about Washington as a person after Washington's death. Were his assessments of him accurate, do you think?
As is often the case with Jefferson, yes and no. He wrote a lot about Washington after his death. And the final chapter of the book focuses on that. In part, he was very upset by John Marshall's biography of George Washington, because John Marshall, of course, was a Federalist. He was the Supreme Court Justice. He was very, very sympathetic to Washington, but also very sympathetic to the Federalist political agenda, and presented Washington as he was, which is as a Federalist. And Jefferson felt that, and he was also critical of Jefferson. Jefferson felt that Marshall got Washington wrong and tried to demonstrate in a lot of his writings and the way he organized his papers after Washington's death and thinking about his own death in such a way as to show that Washington and he agreed on much more than they disagreed about. Because by the time Washington died, people took as given that the two men didn't like each other and didn't agree. And Jefferson spends, I won't say the last 25 years of his life trying to get right with Washington, but he spends a lot of time during his retirement trying to prove to people that Washington and he really did agree on many things. And Washington really liked him and agreed with him. I think that's true for the early part of Washington's presidency. Jefferson overdoes it slightly because he's trying to overcompensate for this Federalist interpretation. He's really bothered by the fact that people think that he and Washington didn't get along.
And so this is a question from Lois Herndon Carter. Did Washington's close relationship with Hamilton cause strain on his relationship with Jefferson? And I'm glad you mentioned Hamilton, because that should surely be a key name in this.
Yes, we're 54 minutes into this. Thank you, Lois. In a word, this is an easy one to answer. Yes. The Washington's cabinet is, as many of you will know, is a struggle for Washington's affection and support between Jefferson and Hamilton. I'm simplifying things greatly and speaking with the tongue slightly in cheek. But yes, that puts a great strain on them. There are two problems with Hamilton from Jefferson's standpoint. Washington agrees with him, and Washington has a bond with Hamilton that he doesn't have with Jefferson because they served together in the war. And Jefferson's on the outside. He doesn't have that bond. And in some ways, although, and Joanne Freeman has shown this, Hamilton and Washington's relationship has its peaks and valleys and has its own tensions, but they have a closeness that Jefferson and Washington never achieve. And Jefferson's aware of that. We've got time for two more questions, Andrew, they're telling us.
Great, yes, excellent. Hamilton does seem very rash. He really split the Federalist ticket in 1800 with his support of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and undermined Adams. You can see why. And Jefferson claimed that when Jefferson showed him what he thought were the three greatest men in the world, Bacon, Newton, and Locke, Hamilton replied, Caesar.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Which is unimaginable. So we've got a question from Mark Chester. Why didn't Jefferson attend Washington's memorial service?
Well, first of all, they were politically estranged at that point. And I do think his visit to Mount Vernon in January of 1801 is an attempt to kind of mend fences. But he's aware of the tensions. He was also, if memory serves, so we're talking December, January of 1799, 1800. He's in Charlottesville, which is quite far away. It's not easy to get to, travel in winter is, there are practical difficulties. And they're estranged at that point.
Certainly after he retires, he never goes back to Washington and only once visits Richmond. He really stays at Monticello or goes out to his other home at Poplar Forest.
That's right.
So we can do one more question, and this is coming from Todd Watson. Will a book on this subject be coming out soon? I promised I wouldn't ask you that. It's always harsh on an author, mid-manuscript.
Todd, I really hope so. I'm making good progress on this manuscript because I'm locked down. I've availed myself of the generosity of, in terms of the digital resources made available to me by both Mount Vernon and Monticello. I'm hoping to have a draft of the whole thing by the end of the year. My fingers are crossed on that. And as anybody out there who's written something knows, a draft doesn't mean you're done. But I'm making good progress, and I'm doing my best. So thank you for that. I also want to apologize to people. I'm in Scotland right now, and although it's quite late, excuse me, that's a tongue twister, it's become quite stormy here, and so it's got quite dark, so I look like I'm being interrogated right now, but I want to assure you that Andrew is treating me very well.
Well, it's very different here. Most of the country's in a heat wave, other than, of course, those areas being affected by Hurricane Laura. Frank, this has been tremendous. Thank you very much. I think, as the last question indicated, you've sufficiently engaged everyone's interest that they now want to read the book, because it will be the first book about this relationship, and it's pretty critical to the general story of the politics, the 1790s. So we're looking forward to that. I'd also like to thank Mount Vernon for co-hosting this with Monticello and Kevin Butterfield, and we look forward to our next broadcast. Thank you very much, Frank.
My pleasure.
Good luck with the writing.
Thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Right. Thanks a lot. Bye.